the screen. It's perfect. Okay, so I think we can start. We are on time, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luigi Amodio. I am the director of the Science Center of Città della Scienza, and I'm very pleased and honored to introduce this meeting. Unfortunately, as you know, as some of you know, due to today's more than bad weather conditions, we had to suspend the opening ceremony of Futuro Remoto, our science festival, and all the starting activities were suspended, the one with the public. But everything will start regularly tomorrow. So, and the weather tomorrow is good, luckily. But today was really terrible. Fortunately, after the pandemic, with the pandemic, we learned to have this kind of meetings, this online meeting that are now normal, even in our festival. In fact, we have events in an exhibition, etc., with the public, but also an online program that will start together. And today we have the very great pleasure to have with us David Leavitt, that in my opinion, but only not only in my opinion, is one of the greatest contemporary writers. He is also a great friend of our country, where he lived for some years. And so, first of all, I want to thank him a lot for being with us. He will discuss, will dialogue and discuss with some friends, and of course with the audience on a subject that I think is very interesting now when we speak about STEAM, that is science, technology, engineering, art, and math, not only STEM. So we talk about STEAM discipline, and the topic is that of the narrative of science, of how we can use science of a matter of narrative. And of course, the idea of organizing this meeting come from two books of David Leavitt that will be discussed later on, and I'm sure that Mr. Leavitt will have a lot of things to say about this topic. The meeting will be led. I'm just opening this meeting. Will be led by Professor Mario Di Bernardo, who is a lot of things. Is among the lot of things is professor of nonlinear systems and automatic control at the University Federico II, and he is also the coordinator of the research area on modeling and engineering risk and complexity of the Scuola Superiore Meridionale, that is a sort of Scuola Normale Superiore that was created in Naples some year ago. And I warmly thank Mario for his participation and his commitment to our festival. But before giving the word to Mario, I am very honored to introduce Tracy Roberts Pounds. She's the Consul General of the United States of America in Naples, and the consulate, as always, has granted its patronage to this initiative, also in the name of a consolidated and fruitful collaboration with Città della Scienza. So please, Madam Consul, give us your greetings to this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a minute since I've done a big meeting like this, as I've been prioritizing, you know, in-person connectivity, and my 11-year-old just almost came storming in to bomb into the background here. So it feels very familiar at the same time as it feels like I've just something I've forgotten to do recently. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Tracy Roberts Pounds. I am the Consul General here in Naples, Consul General to all of the Mezzogiorno, and it's a pleasure to be with your group today. I want to thank all of the Futuro Remoto organizers, President of the Città della Scienza, Dr. Riccardo Villari, Director of the Città della Scienza, Dr. Luigi Amodio, and the moderator, Professor Mario De Bernardo. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Mr. Leavitt, it's great to make your acquaintance virtually, and we're really excited that you had time for us today. As many of you know, Professor Leavitt co-directs the creative writing department at the University of Florida, and he is the author of The Man Who Knew Too Much, Alan Turing and the Invention of the Computer. And this is a work that opens up the interesting discussion about scientific dissemination through art. Despite there is a very pervasive belief that perhaps art and science are opposites, but I think that they actually have quite a bit in common. And since the dawn of time, both science and art have made different attempts in different ways to describe and explain the world around us. And maybe the methods are different, but the goal is the same. In fact, one of my very dear friends when I lived in the old city of Damascus, when I was serving in Syria, was a German rheumatologist who had later gotten an MFA. And it was wonderful to explore the old city of Damascus and see it through her two very different perspectives, and then watch that be reflected in her art that she would do. And then yet she was also able to snap into being a medical professional when that was what was needed. And so I think for me, she embodied this duality that we're talking about today. I'm also the mother of teenagers, and so I also have understand how pervasive, let's say, technology is among young people, and I'm sure many of you have had the same conversation. I usually say, stop ticking, stop talking, stop doing whatever you're doing, and focus on the people around you. But I think there is a real need for us to constantly be thinking about how we can engage with younger generations of people, of our society, on scientific research and the importance of bringing all of us closer to a dialogue about science. And for the past more than almost 36 years, beginning here in Naples and then expanding remotely, Futuro Remoto has been a showcase for scientific outreach and contributed significantly to bringing students, young professionals, and the general public closer to scientific and technological innovation. So it's an honor for us to continue collaborating with you in that space. One of our main objectives here at the consulate is obviously supporting shared cultural and scientific initiatives between Italy and the United States. And so it's wonderful to have partner in the Città della Scienza. We've also seen other great fruits of our partnership up in space. And so I think it's just really an extraordinary and important element of our cooperation. I want to thank everyone again today for organizing this event and for allowing me to be here with you. And I know that despite the really apocalyptic weather happening all around us today, it's great to have a couple of moments to step into another space and to think about how we're all connected and to think about what it all means. So thank you very much. And with that, turn the floor back over.
Il microfono, Mario.
Sorry, it always happens, this kind of thing at meeting online. I was thanking you, Tracy, for your introduction, and thank you, Luigi, again for introducing me earlier and everybody else. I would like to take this quick opportunity to thank David again for accepting our invitation, first and foremost. My colleagues, Nicola Fusco is professor of mathematical analysis at the University of Naples Federico II, and Vincenzo Bavaro, who is professor of English and American literature at the University Orientale of Naples. They will join me today in this chat with David. Thank Città della Scienza for organizing everything, the consulate for giving us its sponsorship of the event. And I would like to tell all the participants that if they have Q&A questions or comments at the end of the meeting, or while David and us will be chatting, please write them in the chat of these teams so that we can then give you the floor at the end during the Q&A sessions that will follow the talk by David. And so without any further ado, I would like to leave the floor to David and just quickly introduce him. As Tracy said before me, David is an American novelist and biographer among the most important contemporary writer in the US. He's professor of English at the University of Florida. And a few years ago, he wrote 2 books, one on the life of Turing, The Man Who Knew Too Much, L'Uomo che sapeva troppo, that is also available in Italy, and The Indian Clerk, Il Matematico Indiano, available again in Italy, on the lives of these 2 great scientists, Alan Turing and Ramanujan, both with an interesting story life that they will be talking about in a while, and great contributors to many fields of endeavor, from pure mathematics to complexity theory to computer science and so on. And as we said before, as both Tracy and Luigi said before me, this is also an opportunity to bring together students and young researchers from both the humanities and science, which we all think it's a great thing to bring together these seemingly different areas of science and the humanities. So without any further ado, David, I'll leave the floor to you, and then we'll reconnect for the Q&A and the discussion with everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Grazie tanto. I'll speak in English, perhaps now and then a few words in Italian. But first of all, I'm sorry about your weather. If it's any comfort, we had a hurricane exactly a week ago. So I feel your pain. We've had some very, very bad weather recently here. I love events like this, and I don't get to do enough of them. I think the last time I took part in an event in which there was an English professor and a mathematics professor was at Cornell University a few years ago, and it was the first time I think it had ever happened in the history of Cornell that the mathematics department and the creative writing program co-sponsored an event. So it's a really great opportunity. I'll just say a few introductory things, and then I'm at my best answering questions. So the story of how I came to write these 2 books is kind of a story of chance and serendipity. For years, I had been friends with a great editor in New York, the late James Atlas, who died a few years ago. And James was putting together a series of books to be published in the United States under the title Great Discoveries. And there were a series of books about major scientific discoveries. And he approached me about writing the Turing volume. And I knew a lot about Turing's life. And I particularly, I had read the big biography of Turing by Andrew Hodges. I knew about his suicide, although there's some question now, or some people aren't so convinced it was a suicide. I knew about his arrest under the really sort of pernicious law known as the Blackmailers Charter in England, which prohibited acts, quote unquote, acts of gross indecency between adult men in public or private. But I didn't know anything about Turing's work beyond the most basic understanding. I knew that he'd had something to do with the invention of the computer and with early computers, and I knew that he was a famous code breaker. So I had to persuade the editor that I was qualified to write this book, which I was not. But I'm good at vamping. Do you know that word? How we use that word in American English? It's where you sort of talk a lot when you don't have anything to say. So I managed to sort of vamp together a proposal for the book that they were convinced by. And then I suddenly found myself realizing that I now needed to be able to understand Alan Turing's work scientifically and mathematically, so that I entered into this period of just immersing myself in number theory and logic principles for the Turing book, a certain amount of philosophy. I read all of Turing's original papers, and I read them painstakingly and kind of compelled myself to learn his rather peculiar notational systems, things like that. It was a crash course. And at the end of it, I wrote a book that I think is in some ways better and fresher because I did the research so quickly. In other words, if I'd taken 5 years or 6 years to do the research, I think the book would have been longer and not as interesting. It would probably not have, it would have had fewer errors, but it wouldn't be as fun to read, I don't think. So that was a very, very positive experience for me. I became very fascinated by Turing. I felt an extraordinary sense of kinship with him. We have the same birthday, which is an interesting coincidence. And while I was researching the book, at a certain point when you're delving into the world of Alan Turing, you have to deal with the Riemann hypothesis. And the Riemann hypothesis, one of the great unproven hypotheses of mathematics. A great help to me was that right around that time, I think 3 books had come out written by mathematicians for a general audience about the Riemann hypothesis. And these books were incredibly helpful to me in that they proved that it was possible to write about mathematics for a non-specialist audience, for an audience who you could assume of people who were intelligent but knew absolutely nothing, i.e. someone like myself. So those were really kind of revelatory to me. And in the course of learning about the Riemann hypothesis, I stumbled upon the story of Srinivasa Ramanujan, the great Indian mathematician who after a difficult childhood and adolescence in India, in which he was really undervalued, was rescued by the mathematician G.H. Hardy and brought to Cambridge. And the novel tells the story of Ramanujan's friendship with Hardy, which was a very complicated one, and also about his years in Cambridge as a very, very devout Hindu Brahmin who had lived the entirety of his life in South India. Imagine what it must have been like to suddenly find yourself in the Cambridge of just Cambridge immediately before the First World War. The cold weather alone. So I became completely immersed in the story, and I wrote The Indian Clerk. And then I kind of moved on to other subtypes of subject matter, but it was a great experience for me. It was really, I would say, one of the high points of my career as a writer in terms of my own sense of fulfillment. Both those books were very, very satisfying and fun to write, which is not something I would say about most of my books. I want to end on I'm sorry to say, a rather cynical and fretful note. I teach at the University of Florida, which is an enormous university with more than 50,000 students, and principally a reputation as a STEM school. that is currently, for example, investing $100 million in AI research. I wish I could say that there was a lot of communication going on between the people in the sciences and in the College of Engineering and those of us in the English department, but unfortunately there isn't. And I blame the university on that. The university does absolutely nothing to encourage interaction. At the moment, the university, well, I won't get into this at great length because it's our sort of local battle, but my sense is they're actually trying to keep the departments apart and in as competitive a mode with one another as possible. The only exception has been the medical school. And our medical school here, we have a great relationship with them. Our students often work with the faculty of the medical school, particularly in programs to encourage patients to write about their experiences, and almost, writing as a form of therapy. So that is a very positive and happy collaboration. But I'm sorry to say my relationship with the mathematics department here is pretty much zero right now, which sort of saddens me. However, I love the idea of STEAM. I think it's a wonderful idea, but this is the first time I've heard it. I'm certainly not hearing people talk about it at the University of Florida. All I'm hearing is STEM, 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 and then in a little dark voice, the humanities. Problem, the humanities. The humanities don't bring in any grant money. Anyway, I'll stop there because I'm about to go into a tirade about the University of Florida, and this is not the time to do it. So I'm very happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay, thank you so much, David. Thanks a lot. Loads of points for further discussion. I would like to invite again members of the audience who have questions or comments or anything to write them in the chat. If you want, also in Italian, and I'll be happy to translate them for David, but David knows Italian quite well. So plenty of things to talk about. I was thinking maybe to start from something you said about the Riemann hypothesis as the link between Turing, Ramanujan, and their science. And so I would ask maybe Nicola to say something about their science and maybe the Riemann hypothesis and some comments from him.
Okay. Thanks, Mario, and good afternoon to everyone. Let me say that we are today talking about Turing and Ramanujan, who, as David Leavitt said, are linked by this problem of Riemann hypothesis. But from my point of view, they were, I'm a mathematician, they were two kinds of mathematicians, very different one from the other. Let me point out the difference because this is a sort of, they are a sort of typical kind of mathematicians in a way, but different. Ramanujan was a kind of person who was strongly driven by his intuition. Usually one thinks of mathematics as a rigorous science. Well, the most rigorous science by definition. We always say something, to say that something is 100% sure with this is mathematically sure. On the other hand, Ramanujan proved very little of his theorems. He more or less left a huge amount of results for a mathematician, especially for a mathematician who lived so little as he did. He proved almost 4,000 theorems, which are collected in the famous notebooks. But in these notebooks, there are very little proofs. It seems that he was driven by vision. He didn't care too much to give details, but it can, and in fact, after he died, and when these notebooks were studied by scores of professional mathematicians who tried to understand the ideas behind the theorem stated there. And some of these theorems, I can say, opened new areas of research in mathematics, especially in number theory, in the theory of hypergeometric series. When scores of professional mathematicians read these notebooks, they were astonished by the fact that among these almost 4,000 theorems, maybe 10 or 12 of them were wrong. The other ones were true results. And in particular, one of them was proved to be true only in 1976. And starting from these ideas contained in this theorem by Ramanujan, the field of so-called modular theory of elliptic integrals started, which eventually led 20 years later to the proof of another great mathematical conjecture, Fermat theorem. So really, the mathematical personality of Ramanujan, it's absolutely outstanding. It was also for contemporary, for his contemporaries, he was absolutely amazing, because he always showed an ability in doing heavy calculations, which was completely uncommon. I don't know if the young people in the audience know the story of the taxi cab number. When Ramanujan was in hospital, he was visited by Hardy, the British mathematician who took him Cambridge, as David Leavitt said. And Hardy, entering in his room, said to Ramanujan, "I took a taxi cab numbered 1729, and this number looks a dull number to me." And Ramanujan said immediately, "Not at all, it's a very interesting number. It's the smallest integer that you can write in two different ways as the sum of two cubes. In fact, 1729 is 1 to the cube plus 12 to the cube, but it also 9 to the cube plus 10 to the cube. And in fact, it's the smallest integers which has this property." And by the way, after the story was told, some mathematicians tried to see if they were able to discover other numbers with this property, and now these kind of numbers are studied in number theory and are called taxi cab numbers. But what is really astonishing is that Ramanujan, just in a moment, said to answer to his friend that this number had this property. Another interesting story concerning Ramanujan is again connected to a simple problem in number theory. Suppose you have a street with a long row of houses, all numbered from 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And at a certain point, there is a house whose number is exactly equal to the sum of the numbers of all the houses on the left, but also equal to the sum of all the numbers to the right. And okay, when this story was told to Ramanujan, it was told to him, okay, now, if the number of the houses is between 50 and 500, how many houses with this property there will be? And again, he was able to give this problem as multiple solutions. He was able immediately to say what the solution was. So for a mathematician, this is I mean, really something which is very difficult to believe. Anyway, Turing was at a completely different personality, also from the mathematical point of view. He was more a scientist which was aware of the social implications of his work, of the philosophical implication of his work. As David said before, is famous for being the one of the first who designed modern computer architecture. He was the first one to use the word artificial intelligence more than 70 years ago. But at the same time, he was designing the future of computer science in a famous paper that he published in 1936. He was very well aware of the limit of computer science itself. In this sense, he was embedded in the debate of science in the first half of last century, because it is interesting to note that in this paper, after describing what is now called the Turing machine, the first kind of computer machine, he also addresses and solves a theoretical problem which was posed by another very famous mathematician, Hilbert, a few years ago, the so-called halting problem. That is, suppose you have a computer program, you have a certain input. Can you tell a priori that the computer will run the program given the input in a finite time or not, or it will take an infinite time? Well, in this paper, Turing discusses this problem and proves that the halting problem is undecidable. That is, there is no algorithm that can tell you a priori if a computer will be capable to carry on the program in finite time or will end up in a loop forever. And the fact that there are problems that were undecidable was something that was in the air in other fields of science at that time. And Turing was very well aware of this, because just 3 years before he published this paper, the Austrian mathematician Kurt Gödel proved a famous logic theorem which states that given any sound mathematical theorem based on non-contradictory axiom, within the theory there will be statements which you cannot decide a priori if they are true or false. Again, saying that in science there are things that you cannot sort out, that are simply undecidable. And the same happened again few years before Turing paper within physics, when Heisenberg, with his uncertainty principle, stated that no matter how precise your measurements tools are, there is a fundamental limit in the accuracy by which you can say, for instance, what is the position, the velocity, or the momentum of a given particle at the same time, at a certain time. So again, introducing the idea that also in physics, there are things that you cannot say precisely, that are simply undecidable. And Turing, for all his life, had very clear the idea that science was a powerful, great powerful tool to understand the world around us, but also that science has limits. And this, I think, is a less known but interesting aspects of his scientific personality.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Thanks a lot. I just a quick question for David, because Nicola was talking about these two very different ways of being a scientist and making science, one based on intuition and the other on a systematic. And I think, so David, you explored these in your books. How much do you think the life stories and the fact that different cultures contributed to this?
Well, this is the aspect of the story that, as a writer, interests me the most, and it's the extent to which who they were as men affected the work that they did, or determined the work that they did, and they were entirely different kinds of mathematicians. I thought that was such a beautiful and lucid portrait of how they differed. So thank you for that. Let me start with Turing. I would say there are two things that are really important to remember about Turing as a person when trying to kind of explore or follow his trajectory as a scientist. One is that he was incredibly literal-minded, and I don't think I think I'm very literal-minded, and I think that literal-mindedness is something that is actually a big part of imagination. When Turing wrote his, one of his first great papers in which he was offering a proof, a logical proof, I believe the story was that one of his professors had said something like, well, could a machine do it? And he took that literally. And so that was how he ended up conceiving of the idea of the computer, the thinking machine, or at least a machine that could, the universal machine initially, a machine that could perform the function of every other machine algorithmically. It was a very literal way of thinking. Computer at that time in English meant women who spent their time doing calculations on paper. A computer was usually a woman who would sit all day calculating, logarithms, things like that. So he took the idea of a computer and the idea of a machine, and through his literal mindedness, he made this huge creative leap. I think the other crucial aspect of Turing's history is that he was very openly gay and very unapologetic at a time when to be a gay man in England was a crime. As I mentioned before, the Labouchere Amendment, the so-called Blackmailers Charter, criminalized, quote unquote, acts of gross indecency between adult men in public or private, which meant that every time two men slept together, they were committing a crime. The crime was intermittently enforced, but it was not actually abolished until 1967, which is sort of extraordinary to me. So Turing understood about secrets. He understood about the risk and danger of revealing secrets. He had some very unhappy experiences in his youth because of his, in a sense, he was too literal minded to go into the closet about being gay. He didn't think there was anything wrong with it, and therefore he couldn't understand why anyone else would, and that doomed him at that time and in that place. I think a lot of Turing's most imaginative work, when he in the work about on the thinking machine, the so-called not the this is the later paper, the really almost sort of philosophical paper that deals with whether a machine can, the Turing test, whether a machine can persuade you that it's a human being. A lot of the language in that essay seems to me to be also about Turing's desire to assert his own legitimacy as a human being, given that he lived in a time in which he was essentially told this very fundamental aspect of your nature, your attraction to other men, makes you less than human. So that was, I think, strongly influenced his line of thought, and the work that he did, and then of course, led to the tragedy of his death. One of the great ironies was that the government was incredibly worried that Turing might be a spy, or might become a spy, or might be somehow seduced over to the other side after World War II. This was so wrong-headed because Turing, well, first of all, he took the oath of secrecy at Bletchley Park so much to heart that he would never have divulged any of the information, any of the work that he'd done there. And the irony of, I think there was this assumption that because he was gay, he was vulnerable because he was so afraid of being exposed. But he didn't, I think, actually really care about being exposed until he was arrested, at which point his life really took a terrible turn. And then I'll just quickly say about Ramanujan, because I don't want to just keep talking and talking. Ramanujan was a visionary, and he attributed a lot of his mathematical discoveries to a goddess, Hindu goddess, whom he sort of portrayed as kind of a muse. And he would describe the visions that he would have, the numbers just appearing in front of him. This was a very Eastern, very Hindu way of talking about mathematical discovery. And then, so there was a great irony that his mentor, the person who discovered him and really did everything he could to help him, G.H. Hardy, was an atheist, and not only an atheist, but an extremely noisy atheist, someone whose disbelief in God was so intense as to almost seem to be a form of belief. And so this was what was fascinating to me about their relationship was, I think Hardy had a very hard time accepting the fact that Ramanujan really was a pious Hindu, and couldn't really reconcile his own idea of mathematical discovery with this idea of visions being provided by a goddess. And so he kept trying to rationalize it by saying, that's just the story that Ramanujan is telling so that his family won't be upset back in India. But I think it was really, Ramanujan was a visionary. And what I think one of the reasons that, as you said, there are so many theorems and so few proofs was because these mathematical ideas came to him through vision. And finally, one of Ramanujan's discoveries that I find particularly fascinating, was the formula he came up with for partition, how to calculate the partition number of a number, which is essentially how many ways can you divide a certain number of things. And I give you an example of how I wrote about this is I made that scene a cooking scene. He's preparing rasam, which is a lentil dish, and he's looking at the lentils, and he lines up 6 lentils and starts thinking, well, how many ways can 6 lentils be divided up? You could divide it into 5 and 1. You could divide it into 2 and 2 and 1. You could divide it into 3 and 2. And eventually you will be able to calculate what the partition number is of the number 6. Subsequently discovered that as numbers get bigger, partition numbers get huge. And he came up with this extraordinary looking formula or equation, I'm not sure I'm using the right word, for calculating the partition number of any number. And for a non-mathematician like me, who doesn't really understand all the symbols, it's just the most astonishing thing to look at the partition and to see how complex the equation is, considering how simple the question is. That is, I think, the thing that the taxi cab number is another example. There is a fundamental, the complexity that is involved in understanding something that seems very basic and simple. This is one aspect of Ramanujan, and it was one that fascinated me when I was writing about him.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And going on with this, going back to this thing you said about writing, you as a non-mathematician, writing about the life stories and science of these people, I would like to leave the floor to Vincenzo for to explore these aspects of your work.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, David. I have a lot of questions and notes, and of course, I'm here as a representative of the humanities problem, to borrow from David's words. Surely I'm an outsider, so I'm trying to. I have a lot of notes again, and I will share them with you at least until the students have better questions that are from the field of mathematics. One of the things that I was fascinated by, the work is very ambitious, and you did some amazing research. There's so much there. So one of the things that I loved was the representation of mathematics. On the one hand, you have this Russell's idea of this ideal realm of this house in the town on the hillside among the mist, or you have the idea of an airtight realm, almost immune from the outside influences. On the other hand, you have this idea that mathematics is the instrument to reduce chaos into an order. I loved how the problem of what lies outside of the representation of mathematics plays into our understanding of mathematics as a field, especially as it was in the 30s and 40s appropriated by national propagandas or national discourse, how the Germanic idealism, the Italian and logics. So to start from what Mario said before, the intuition and ingenuity, intuition as a paradigm. I was wondering, as intuition as something we say like thinking outside of the box. And I was wondering to what extent, let me put this first question out there. To what extent is queer subjectivity, like both of these mathematicians are in a, I'm probably going to phrase this later better, but for now is Alan Turing, looking backward, could we say that he was somehow queering mathematics? Is his position as an outsider or as an oblique insider allowed him to see something that those who were in the box could not see? Again, like you said before, David, that one of the paradoxes of these stories is that, especially Alan Turing, like let's focus on Turing. You said that there's all this talk about artificial intelligence and computing, where the center of your story in the Man Who Knew Too Much, also you need to tell me about the title later, is the very idea of the human, of a personhood, and how a queer subject was excluded from nationhood, from personhood, how his deprivation of this status put him paradoxically in a privileged position to see something that then was useful in his job.
You're muted, David.
Yes, I just sorry, I had to. I'm a little unfamiliar with Microsoft Teams. You know, I think it's a really interesting question, and what I would say is that if you look at Turing's life history, there are a couple of episodes that I think are central. One very early was his friendship with Christopher Morcom, who was one of his schoolmates, also a scientist, with whom I think Turing was quite in love. Although I think it was probably not a reciprocated love when he was a teenager. And Morcom died very young, and this was a huge crisis and tragedy for Turing. And he wrote a letter to Morcom's mother, which I think is one of the most beautiful things he wrote, about wanting to continue on in mathematics, you know, as a way of keeping alive his relationship with Morcom, even though Morcom was now dead. And I think Morcom's early death meant that Turing always had in his mind a kind of romantic ideal, a life that he had perhaps hoped to have of a sort of, you know, he was in love with Morcom. I think he envisioned that they would be together in some capacity for the rest of their lives. Well, probably reality would have destroyed that as they grew up. But before reality could destroy it, and he could then, having been bruised by loss, maybe go on and find another relationship. This Morcom's early death meant that this ideal stayed alive in his mind. And I think it was one reason why he had such a hard time sustaining relationships when he did have lovers with them. He had a very hard time sustaining them, and the reason he had a hard time sustaining them was because none of them could live up to this dream that was all the more ideal because it could never be fulfilled. Then I would say later in his life, and this is information that I learned after I finished the book when I was participating in a documentary about Turing called Codebreaker. The period in his life after his arrest, when he was being forced to undergo the quote unquote therapy that actually consisted of chemical castration, and when he was being followed everywhere by the police, and he became very cynical and sort of his late letters are full of a kind of a bitter, what I would call a sort of a bitter gay self-deprecating wit and humor. He refers to the policemen following him as I think the poor dears, because they have to be kept so busy following him, and he's not doing anything of any interest. He did have a boyfriend in Norway, and so when we were making the documentary, we went to Tinmouth because that was where he would catch the ferry to Norway. So I think toward the end of his life, this idea of being constantly under surveillance, constantly regarded as a threat, really an enemy alien inside his own country, had to be a major factor in contributing to his suicide. And I do believe personally that his death was a suicide. It's a very tragic story. And the tragedy then continues beyond Turing's death, because for many, many, many years, no one acknowledged Turing. The work that he did a lot of the credit was given to other people, particularly John von Neumann. And the most heroic figure, I think, in the there are two figures who really we must take off our hats to or bow before for the work that they did on behalf of Turing. And one, of course, is Andrew Hodges, his biographer. But the one who I think is even more important is Martin Gilbert. Martin Gilbert, a brilliant mathematician, historian of mathematics. For a long time, as he said, for a lot of lonely years, he was the one voice saying Turing deserves credit. And now he's getting it, finally, but it's been a long road.
I just want to add something about the delay in recognition, because probably David didn't say it before, and maybe some of our younger students don't know. Only in 2009, the Prime Minister Gordon Brown declared apologies and pardon for Alan Turing, and only in 2013 Queen Elizabeth acknowledged this. Also, one other thing, like most of us in the 21st century, probably we know Alan Turing because of the movie. And obviously your book comes like about 10 years before the movie. And if we look at the time when you were writing the book and publishing that book, there was very little outside of probably of the field of mathematicians. Very few people knew anything about Alan Turing. So that like makes even more remarkable the intervention that you did with the publication of that book. Thank you.
Let me say that
I'm not. David.
I was just going to say, I'm not a huge fan of that movie, and I would say don't trust that movie at all. It is it's full of inaccuracies. A lot of dramatic license was taken, but it also has some I think kind of what I would almost say were libels against Turing. The implication that Turing would ever have sold secrets to the Soviets, which the movie makes, is, I think, an outrageous lie. And anyone who has read anything that Turing has written or knows anything about him had to be deeply offended by that implication in the movie. So the movie is not the last word. In fact, I don't even know that it's the first word.
David,
yes, Nicola.
David, may I ask you a question concerning Turing and what happened to him because of his homosexuality and the arrest and so on? Because it seems very strange to me that I'm sure that there were many people, politicians and army officials who knew very well which were the contribution of Turing during World War II. You know very well that some people say that Winston Churchill privately once stated that Turing probably gave the biggest single contribution to defeat the Nazi army. Well, we don't know if Winston Churchill really said this or not, but he could have said, because this is true. So how do we explain that, notwithstanding his great contribution to the victory and the fact that important people in the government knew this, he was arrested and he was treated in this way?
So this question I actually can answer because I know the answer to it, which I don't to most questions. After the war, when the Cold War period began, there was a tremendous paranoia in the UK over the idea of the sort of homosexual as spy. And it was, a lot of it was fed by the famous scandals involving, Guy Burgess and Anthony Blunt and some of the other, the Cambridge spies, as they were known, who actually were Soviet spies in positions of power in England. But the Cold War paranoia was such that there was this perception that if someone was gay, a man, he was extremely vulnerable either to blackmail or to seduction by, say, a KGB agent. And this happened. There are numerous, one of the most interesting stories, it's told in a book called The Fatal Englishman by Sebastian Fox, is the story of what was his name? I'll remember in a second, but this was a young gay man who was essentially ended up becoming a double agent. He was blackmailed into working for the KGB. The British government had him, he was playing both sides. It drove him crazy, and he committed suicide. And the irony is that, and again, I'm sorry for my name blanking, is that his father was the politician who was responsible. Oh, Jeremy Wolfenden was his name. And his father, Wolfenden, was the author of the Wolfenden Amendment, which eradicated finally the Labouchere Amendment in 1967. So this was a common phenomenon. And I think in Turing's case, there was this idea that he had government secrets and that he was very likely to sell them or somehow be seduced or blackmailed into giving them over to the Soviets. There was no reality behind this fear. First of all, the secrets that he had all had to do with the Enigma machine and the bomb, the machine for decoding the Enigma machine. Well, they were secrets only they belonged to history because the Enigma machine was never going to be used again. Nonetheless, there was this, great kind of cult of secrecy in the UK. There still is. A lot of papers remain classified, of a paranoid kind of obsession with secrecy, and a paranoid obsession with the idea of secrets being sold or somehow obtained by the enemy. Alan Turing would never, if he made a vow, a promise, he would keep it. This was part of his literal mindedness. He believed he was someone who I think was in a certain sense incapable of lying, which was part of the reason he ended up getting arrested in the first place.
Yeah, David, thank you. Thank you, Nicola, for the question. Vincenzo actually mentioned something earlier on that made me curious, which is the genesis of the title of your book, The Man Who Knew Too Much.
So The Man Who Knew Too Much is, of course, a famous film by Alfred Hitchcock. In the introduction to the piece, I talk about another great British film, The Man in the White Suit. And I see a lot of parallels between the story of the Man in the White Suit and Alan Turing. The reason I chose the title The Man Who Knew Too Much was because of the double meaning. He knew too much in the sense that he was so far ahead of his time in what he was able to envision. The fact that he was actually able to envision the idea of artificial intelligence principally, but he also knew too much because he had in his mind a lot of information that was classified and secret, and that made him therefore that resulted in the government and the police perceiving him as a major security risk. So I sort of bounced in my own head from one of my favorite British movies to another of my favorite British movies, and ended up with the title The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Okay, thank you. So before continuing, I just want to ask the audience, any of the students who are attending, if they have any question or comments. Feel free to activate your mic if you want to ask directly. Okay, so there is a question in the chat from Luigi Ferrara. He says, I am a 14-year-old student, like a real kid passionate about science and technological development. My question is based on a curiosity. I've read the Alan Turing story about the Enigma's project, and I noticed that the machine invented by Alan and his colleagues had no practical purpose in World War II, but certainly for the technological development of today's computer. So a question automatically arises, is it probable that the figure of a scientist faced with the possibility of extreme discovery gets carried away by the pleasure of discovering, as Feynman said, and does not think about the practical consequences of his invention discovery? It's quite an intricate question for a 14-year-old, but thank you for asking. It's in the chat, David.
Well, I would say I'd be interested in hearing how other people would answer this, but I think that Turing was, we have this, we say in English, and I'm sure you say it's true in Italian, you talk about, pure science versus applied science. And Turing did both. I mean, during World War II, when he created the bomb, there was a specific problem to solve, which was how to break the code of the Enigma machine. And he had this sort of brilliant, again, but very literal-minded idea. Well, if you have a machine that encodes, then you create a machine that decrypts. Only a machine can talk to another machine. And only a machine can challenge another machine. Now, of course, your questioner is right. The bomb had absolutely no use. It was a single function machine. And Turing's earlier work had been about the idea, at least theoretically, of a universal machine, a machine that could act like any other machine, or behave like any machine. And he proved that such a machine could exist. His later work, I think, was much more imaginative. He was really interested in the potential of computers once he became involved in the engineering and the building of computers. I think another interesting aspect of his mind is that he was, I think, half a philosopher and half an engineer. He was deeply involved in the actual construction and design of computers, but he was also thinking philosophically about the implications for the future. And I think he was really interested in basically in the fundamental question, what makes a person a person? And his defense of the thinking machine was essentially very much ahead of its time, because he was saying, allow personhood to be something that people determine for themselves, not something that is determined for them from outside. And that was very threatening, not just to the scientific establishment, but to the church, which perceived him as somehow anti-religious, and also it appealed to a kind of a paranoia about the idea of the machines taking over. Well, that, of course, is a subject of how many novels have been written about that. This is, I think, a fundamental human fear, and it had first been articulated in Samuel Butler's novel Erewhon. Of course, we've seen many movies and novels and stories since then, but a lot of his more philosophical work met with tremendous resistance and a certain amount of fear, because the popular press, when he talked about the idea of a thinking machine, immediately followed up with, will the machines take over? So, I mean, this is why people are so interested in Turing. What an extraordinary range of work he did, and enough to talk about for the rest of our lives.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks. Are there more questions or comments from the audience? Maybe Nicola.
No, Mario, just I wanted to add to what David just said, that from my point of view, Turing was not only a powerful theoretical scientist, a pure mathematician, but he was also very well aware of the applications of the theory he was studying. I just want to say that maybe not many people know, but he was involved just after World War II in the software of the first stored programmed computer, which was, if I remember well, Manchester Mark I code. And he even wrote the user's manual by himself. So he was, from this point of view, a person who certainly was able to do all the implementation of the theory, even to the most practical point of view. But not only this, I like the title, The Man Who Knew Too Much, because he really knew a lot. He was able to foresee things that happened in science many decades after, because in the 50s, beginning of the 50s, he devised a machine that he called Delilah, which was able to encrypt and decrypt speech. And he presented this machine, this is really strange, he presented this machine to army officials, and to explain them how effective the machine was, he took a recorded speech of Winston Churchill, encrypted it, and then decrypted, and say to these people, well, you can use this machine to communicate by telephone. At that time, it was the only kind of communication, but now we know that similar encrypting systems are used when you chat on WhatsApp, or when you use your mobile phone. And very strangely, these people in the army say they were not interested in the machine. So he knew too much. He really
Thank
knew
you,
too
Nicola.
much.
Thank you, Nicola. I don't see any more questions in the chat. I don't know if Vincenzo, you want to add something?
Yes,
You're
as
mute.
I
Yes.
said, I have a lot of little notes and things that I wanted to talk with David about. I loved one thing that I think you wrote at some point in the book, that is something about mistakes, and how, and that's again what I believe is his ability to think outside of the box, how to make mistake. And this is something Nicola was talking about before also, the undecidability. There is a level of mistakes that must be a part of the process if we want. Like, I think he said something like, for a machine to be intelligent, it needs to be able to make mistakes. And this is like, I feel like, to me, that was very enlightening. The other thing was symbols. If mistake is a keyword, so to speak, to some of his work, obviously the symbol of the apple is a big one as well. And I wonder if you could tell us more about the apple.
Unmute myself. Okay. So yeah, there's because Turing died as a result of eating an apple that had been dipped in cyanide. And there are a lot of this fact has, I mean, it's such a macabre and sort of literary way of committing suicide that it has led to there's a lot of mythology surrounding it. One of the myths was that the logo of Apple computers, the apple with the bite taken off of it, was a nod to Turing, but that's actually not true. It's just a kind of a fortuitous coincidence. It is true that I believe it was Sleeping Beauty, the Disney version of Sleeping Beauty, was his favorite movie, and he would always quote the line of the evil queen, "Dip the apple in the brew, let the sleeping drought come through." And so there's this sort of idea of, the Sleeping Beauty who's awakened by the kiss from the prince. That's how I end the book, referring to this, since I knew that was, his favorite film. So yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which Turing has kind of fed into popular culture and become a kind of mythic figure. Another example, an earlier, very important figure in the history of the computer, who is now attaining that status, is Ada Lovelace, who was, among other things, I believe, the niece of Lord Byron, and was involved long before Turing was a mathematician and was involved in the construction of a sort of early proto computer, not a calculating machine. So there's so much room. There's so much to be written about these people, and I always appreciate it, although I don't see it that often, when I see fiction writers or imaginative writers writing about science and writing about these kind of extraordinary creative figures. And you know, when I was working on these books, my respect for mathematicians became so immense, because not just the ability to do mathematics, which is extraordinary to me since I don't possess it, but the incredible level of imagination and creativity. And so I think something that I'm hoping to see continue is, I think that as I mentioned before, there's more and more writing about science that is intended for a general audience, and there are more and more writers who are making it their ambition to communicate a lot of this very complex information, not in the private or sort of shop language that scientists and mathematicians use, but in a language that will make it accessible. And that was why it was so curious that while I was working on the Turing book, the 3 books about the Riemann hypothesis, 3 books for a general audience, were published, and I read all 3. They took radically different approaches, and I don't think any of them allowed for a complete understanding of the Riemann hypothesis, which I think you have to be a mathematician to possess. But I learned so much, and I was so grateful to those 3 authors for writing those books. And I'm seeing more and more. Another example is Stephen Strogatz at Cornell, who has done some wonderful writing about mathematics for the rest of us.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Vincenzo. I would like to spend, for the sake of time, I think we have 10 minutes left. I would like to go back to something that we all mentioned, and David mentioned himself at the beginning of this meeting today, which is the relationship between humanities and science. Because 2 years ago, in the same event, in the past edition of this event, we had Saul Perlmutter, who is a Nobel laureate for physics, who is advocating the importance of teaching the scientific methods to the humanities. He's made a mission of this, he goes around universities, and he came here as well, to talk about how important it is to give the elements, the foundations of the scientific methods also to people studying humanities, to bridge a gap between the 2 cultures. And I would like to end picking your brain, and then Nicolas and Vincenzo, about what do you think could be a way of bridging the gap, of getting these 2 areas closer together, and to allow them to cross-fertilize more?
Well, I think it's simply a matter of people talking to one another, and unfortunately, opportunities for, let's just stay for the moment within the realm of mathematicians. How many opportunities are there for people in the humanities and people in mathematics to talk? I don't think that the way that at least most large American universities are structured encourages that degree of interaction. Quite the opposite, unfortunately. And there's also, I think, well, like when I was working on the Indian Clerk, it so happened that at that time, the editor of the Ramanujan Journal, which is a mathematical journal devoted to Ramanujan's work, was teaching. He was the chair of the English department at the University of Florida. And when I had lunch with him, I thought, well, we have so much to talk about, but we didn't have anything to talk about because well, the main roadblock we ran up against was that he at one point said to me, well, you know, all this talk about that Turing, that G.H. Hardy was gay. Why does that matter? That's not relevant at all. And this was almost like a conversation stopper. I realized, I started to try to explain to him, and then I realized it was just a waste of time. Now, that's certainly not true with all mathematicians. I know a lot of mathematicians who are extremely eager and happy to talk to writers, and actually people like Martin Gilbert. When I met him, that was a wonderful, wonderful meeting, and I was so humbled by simply being in his company. I'm sorry, did I say Martin Gardner? I meant Martin Davis. I have been making, you have to forgive me. It's been a long week. Every time I said Martin Gardner, I meant Martin Davis.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, those opportunities are rare. And I think that the reason that they are rare is because university administrations don't do very much to encourage them. And in fact, they kind of discourage them by, at least at our university, suggesting that all these departments are somehow these isolated units. That's the word they use, units, that are in a sense competing. Who's going to get the most money out of the budget? That to me is something we need to work to get past, and it's the simplest thing in the world, is just bring people together.
Okay, thank you, David. Nicola, do you have any?
Yes, just let me answer very quickly to Leavitt that he just told us that he admires mathematicians. I must say the converse. I admire a lot writers, philosophers, historians, and coming to your question, Mario, if scientific method would be useful in humanities, I don't know. I don't know if it would be really useful if you have to write a novel, if you have to write a poem. But I would be a little bit more ambitious. I'm sure that scientific method would be very useful to common people. If common people would use just a bit of scientific method in their approach to life, I'm sure that world will be much, much better, that a lot of fake news and stupid things that you hear around will not exist, and even I'm sure that if even politicians would use scientific methods, they would realize that in many issues they would agree much more than they usually do when they speak one to the other.
Thank you, Nicola. Vincenzo, over to you.
Yes, okay. So I'm so humbled and inspired by scientific methods but one thing that I wanted to talk about is the idea of contamination as a nurturing endeavor. And David mentioned isolation, that has been a recurring keyword in this lecture. How the representation of a genius is often taken to be an isolated individual above and beyond reality. And both in the book and in the story, in the biographies we read, genius is very much part of social context, of culture. They are shaped by events outside of their will. So a humanist approach probably is an approach that invites collaboration, invites thinking outside of the box, invites thinking outside of the isolating boundaries of a disciplinary fields. As much like your work is inspiring because you put Turing, for example, in the middle of a network that was pre-existing him, that was all over the place. When you talk about King's College and what happened, the sexual policies in King's College, this is all stuff that we need to, and probably this is a humanist approach to what the hell was going on there, what the events that shaped this genius as this mind. So I'm very much, I believe in this collaboration and this mutual understanding and mutual collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I might
Yes,
add
please,
just
David.
one very quick thing. You know, I live in Florida, where we have our governor is Ron DeSantis. Our odious governor is very likely, well, certainly, well, there's a very good chance he will be our next president, which, having lived in Florida under DeSantis, is a very frightening prospect. The thing I've noticed about when I hear conversations about STEM is that I loved STEAM, first of all, with the A, but it's usually ST and then a huge E and then a smaller M. Engineering is where all the focus is because the emphasis is entirely on the idea of the university existing to equip students to get jobs. It's all about jobs. It's all about commerce. It's the university as Republicans envision it. And this is, I think, what the Republicans are doing to the University of Florida is they're turning it into a kind of a vocational training institute. And that's why most of the funding in the sciences is going toward what are perceived as the scientific disciplines that are most likely to get students jobs, i.e. engineering. And even in fields where there is great opportunity for creative thought, such as mathematics, physics, chemistry, the emphasis is, again, always on jobs. And this is, to me, a dangerous trend, and it's one that I think threatens my idea of what a university ought to be, which is a place where scholars and artists and students and teachers interact. That's what it was like when I was an undergraduate. It's not what it's like anymore, and at least not where I teach. My sense is at your university in Naples, things are there's a lot, seems to be a lot more communication, and that does my heart good because I'm not witnessing it here. But that's my last pessimistic remark.
Thank you, David. Thank you. No, it's the School for Advanced Studies that Nicola and I are part of. It's trying to bring together people from different endeavor, and it's aimed a little bit at doing that. But so, without any further delay, because I realize that we are at the end of our slot, I would like to thank everyone who was online for joining us today. Nicola and Vincenzo for joining me today in this lovely discussion with David. David for being here again, the Consul General in Naples from the US for sponsorship, for her sponsorship and lovely introduction at the beginning, and Città della Scienza, and everyone for being here with us today. Thank you so much, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you in Naples, David, sometime soon.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you so
welcome.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye, Nicola.
Bye.
Thank you to
Bye,
all.
everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.